intend to meet here for the next 7 weeks, and it's our hope for you that this will really give you an opportunity, should you choose to come for the next 7 weeks, to really start asking big, deep questions about life. And as I'm sure you've read already, if you saw the event on Facebook, we are not here to tell you what to believe. So it's good to know that from the beginning, because otherwise I think the group conversation that we're going to have after I've spoken could look a bit like, so what do Christians believe about this? And what do Christians believe about this? And it's not quite going to work that way. The question I'm going to ask and try and answer this evening is, who is Jesus? So firstly, is there actually any evidence for his existence? And I think a great place to start with this is by saying that no historian would doubt that Jesus existed. There is simply too many sources, too much evidence to suggest that he did exist. So for example, you have the Roman historians Tacitus and Suetonius. You have the Jewish historian Josephus. And Josephus said there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it's lawful to call him a man at all, because he was a doer of wonderful works. So there is evidence that is credible and isn't within the Bible. Then maybe obviously there is evidence within the Bible. And you may say, yeah, but hang on a minute, Paddy, this is the Bible that we're talking about. This was written thousands of years ago. How can we be sure that what we read is actually what the original author wrote? How do we know that what we're reading is what the original author was trying to communicate? And I would argue that actually we can be very confident because of a method that's used by classical historians and scholars called textual criticism. Now, textual criticism looks at two things. Number one, it looks at the period of time between the source being written and the first copy being written. That's the first thing. So obviously the smaller the period of time, the more credible that is. The second thing is the number of copies. And obviously the larger the number of copies, the more credible we would consider our knowledge of that source to be. In academia it's called something called triangulation, where you cross-compare between a number of things. Obviously if you have more sources, you've got more things to cross-compare with. And so if you have a look, you have a number of these books on the table. I'm going to borrow one off Wanu's table, if that's okay. And I apologise there aren't that many, but if you go to page 9, it actually discusses this subject of textual criticism. And what you see here, when you open it up, is there are a number of sources written at a similar period to the New Testament. And what you can see here, for example, you've got Herodotus at the top. And Herodotus was written it was written around 428 BC, with the earliest copy made in AD 900, so there was a time lapse of 1,300 years. You then got Caesar's Gallic War, time lapse of 950 years between the first being written and the first copy being written. And Livy's Roman history, 900 years. And no historian would doubt the credibility of these sources. The New Testament was written between 40 and 100 AD. The first copy was made in AD 130, and we had full manuscripts by AD 350. So depending on how you look at it, the longest period of time between the original being written and the first copy being written is 310 years. But then at a minimum, if it was written at the latter end of that period between 40 and 100 AD, then it could be as small as a 30-year gap, which obviously makes it a lot more credible. So that's the first point in textual criticism. The second point is the number of copies. So Herodotus, I think, has 8 copies, Caesar's Gallic War, 10 copies, Livy's Roman history, 10 copies. The New Testament, 24,300 copies. I think you've got 5,000 Latin copies, a few thousand other Greek copies, and I should have kept this open, shouldn't I, so I can actually tell you. 5,000 Greek copies, 10,000 Latin copies, and 9,300 other copies. And what this is essentially saying is that the Bible, the New Testament in particular, stands overwhelmingly and unapproachably alone in ancient prose writing. It's far more credible than any other source of its time. So we can be certain that Caesar controlled the Roman Empire, but actually we can be more certain that Jesus existed, and we can be certain of the things that he claimed about himself and the things that he did. So we know he existed, but the question is, who was he? And the film director Martin Scorsese, he made a film called The Last Temptation of Christ. And what he was essentially trying to show in this film is that Jesus was a man. He had human emotions, human experiences. He was born to a human being. He suffered. He went through grief, joy, you name it. He went through it just like any other human being. And the Scottish comedian Billy Connolly would, I think, agree with this. He said, "I could never be a Christian, but I have massive respect for Jesus. He was such an interesting and amazing character." And I think that's the typical view. And what he also said is he's a good religious teacher. That's the essential thing to take from Billy Connolly. And that, yeah, this is a very typical view of Jesus, that he was a good religious teacher. But it's not the only view. A reporter turned around to the rock star Bono and said, "Jesus has his realms in the world's great thinkers, but Son of God, isn't that a bit far-fetched?" And Bono said, "No, it's not far-fetched to me. Look, the secular response to the Christian story always goes like this. He was a great prophet, obviously a very interesting guy. But actually Christ doesn't allow you that. He doesn't let you off that hook. Christ says, 'I am God incarnate.' So what you are left with is either Christ was who he says he was, or a complete nutcase. I'm not joking here. The idea that the entire course of civilization for over half the globe could have its fate changed and turned upside down by a nutcase, for me, that's far-fetched." So the question is, what evidence do we actually have to suggest that Jesus was more than a good religious teacher? What about the fact that he claimed to have the answers to life? Most good religious teachers would not point to themselves. They would say, "Don't look at me, look at God." Or in religions without God, they would normally point towards certain teachers. And yet Jesus was someone who said, actually, if you want to experience God, you experience him through me. Like, if you want to see God, look at me. And there were there were three key psychologists throughout the 20th century. You've got Young, who said, "People are hungry for security." You've got Alder, who said, "People are hungry for significance." And you've got Freud, who said, "People are hungry for love." And Jesus said, "I am the bread of life. If you want those hungers satisfied, you come to me." He said, "I." He wasn't pointing to a separate individual or entity. There are many people in this world who are suffering with an emotional darkness, be it depression or anxiety. And Jesus said, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but have the light of life." Many people are fearful of death. In fact, a lot of people don't really want to talk about the subject. It's a bit of a taboo subject, I think, in the Western world. But Jesus says to that, "I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live even though they die." And a reporter actually said to Mother Teresa, "Are you scared of death?" Just a few years before she died. And she responded with this. She said, "How can I be? Dying is going home to God. I've never been afraid of dying. On the contrary, I'm looking forward to it." Many of us are dissatisfied with materialism, and we want some kind of direction, to which Jesus says, "I am the way." Many of us are looking for some kind of spiritual life, some kind of value system. I think in the Western world it's becoming more and more appealing to turn to things like Buddhism. And what's interesting is the Buddha actually said on his deathbed, "I die seeking the truth." Jesus said, "I am the truth." And many of us are asking, well, what's the meaning of life? It's actually the most Googled question. What is the meaning of life? To which Jesus said, "I am the life." He keeps pointing to himself. He's not pointing towards a separate entity or person. What about the fact that he claimed the ability to forgive everyone? The religious lawyers of the day, the Jewish religious leaders, accused him of blasphemy when he said this, because they said, who can forgive sins but God alone? And he also claimed that he would one day judge the world. And we have to ask ourselves, would a good religious teacher claim these things? Underlining good there. Would a good religious teacher claim these things? And there's a number of situations in what's called the Gospels, and these are like 4 different books which account for Jesus' life. And what we read a number of times is that he made a certain claim about himself. And if you look at the Gospel of John, which was written by a man called John, who was one of Jesus' disciples, so he followed Jesus for 3 years of Jesus' life, he writes down that Jesus said, I and the Father are one. It says again, the Jews picked up stones to stone him. But Jesus said, I've shown you many great miracles from the Father. For which of these do you stone me? They said, we're not stoning you for any of these, replied the Jews, but for blasphemy. Because you, a mere human being, claim to be God. Jesus Christ of Nazareth claimed to be God. And that's not a unique text there. There are many different situations where he makes these claims. Many people make many different claims. It doesn't mean they're true. Some people think they're, I don't know, Napoleon or Elvis Presley, and of course, they're not. So the question is, how can we actually test this claim that Jesus was and is God? And for me, there's 3 logical possibilities. Number 1, it was not true, but he didn't know it. In other words, he was insane, he was deluded. Number 2, it was not true, and he knew it. In other words, he was evil. He was some kind of con man. He was trying to lead people on. The third logical option for me is that he was who he said he was. He was God. And I don't know how many of you have read the Narnia series of books. I know there's now films about them, but the author to the Narnia series, a guy called C.S. Lewis, he said, he kind of came to this realization, and he said this, he said, a man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said wouldn't be a great moral teacher. He'd either be insane, or else he'd be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else insane, or something worse. But don't let's come up with any patronising nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He hasn't left that open to us. He didn't intend to. And so what evidence do we actually have that Jesus was speaking truthfully when he made these claims about himself? I think there's 5 really key points, and we'll go through them one by one. The first one, I think, evidence-wise, is his teaching. This is a man who said things that, at the time, were scandalous. It was things like, love your neighbour, forgive those who have sinned against you, love the outcasts in society, things like this, things that just wouldn't have happened at the time. And throughout the ages, people have been so impressed with this kind of teaching. And I would personally argue that although we've had progress in areas of science, technology, etc., I would challenge this idea that we have gone beyond the teachings of Jesus. I don't think anyone to date has trumped them, despite the fact they were 2,000 years ago. And we have to ask ourselves, would these kind of teachings come from someone who was insane or evil? So that's his teachings. The second thing I'd point to is his works. Now, I don't know what you think about me standing up and talking about Jesus, but I wasn't actually brought up in a Christian household. And my parents were going to church, none of us were interested, but I went to a Church of England school, which is quite typical in the UK, and we would go to church like once every term of school. And I hated it, and it was so boring, and I just thought, I don't want anything more to do with this. Why has my thing gone crazy? That's better. But you couldn't say that about Jesus. I really don't think you could say that about Jesus, despite that being the typical belief about Christianity that it's super boring, it's so dull. I don't think you could have ever said that about Jesus. This is a man who turned water into wine, for example. I mean, imagine going out on a night out with Jesus in Maastricht, the guy who turns water into wine. I think that would be a great night. Imagine going walking on St. Peter's Hill. Imagine if we all went together, but only I remembered my lunch. Actually, Jesus found himself in a really similar situation, except there was a few more people. There was actually 5,000. And yet, according to the history books, all these people went away fed. You have to ask yourself, would a good religious teacher have done such a thing? The third thing I'll point to is his character. As I said, he spent time with outcasts. He spoke to women in society that would not have happened within that culture, within that time. And what he was basically saying in that moment is, women are equal to men. That was the most scandalous, radical thing anyone could have done. And when you read these moments, you realise that the women don't always reply straight away because they're just so shocked that a man would actually say this. And yeah, over the years, people have been so impressed with this character. Time magazine actually described Jesus as the most persistent symbol of purity, selflessness, and love in the history of Western man. And then there's a British journalist called Matthew Paris, and he's a journalist not for Time magazine, but for the Times newspaper. Don't get them confused. And he would describe himself as an avowed atheist. And yet he said this, he said, I've got such huge respect for Jesus because his life was so radical, it was so inconvenient. If Jesus had not existed, the church most certainly would not have invented him. And then as well, even this moment where he was nailed to a cross, they're driving nails into his hands, even then, he shouts out to God and says, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. In other words, don't judge them, despite the fact they are putting me in complete agony. I think that's a huge testament to his character. So we looked at his teachings, his works, his character. The fourth thing I'd say is his fulfillment of prophecy. And no one in the history of man, except Jesus, has had a collection of books written about them before they even existed. Let me say that again. No one in the history of man, except Jesus, has had a collection of books written about them before they even existed. So for example, there's a book in the Old Testament. Basically, with the Bible you have an Old Testament, which is what the Jewish religion follow, because they don't believe in a Messiah, to keep it short. And then you have a New Testament, which is where Jesus comes into the picture, and the teaching is about what Jesus taught. But yeah, in the Old Testament, there's a book called Micah, and this was written 700 years before Jesus lived. And it basically prophesied that the Messiah, whoever this was going to be, would be born in Bethlehem. And now if we read the New Testament and we look at these Gospels, which are these 4 books which talk about Jesus' life, we read that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. But it wasn't just this. Jesus actually fulfilled over 350 Old Testament prophecies, 29 in one day, at one stage. And you can make the argument, you could say, well, what if, I mean, Jesus was a Jew, so he would have looked at the Old Testament. What if he went through the Old Testament and he wanted to appear as the Messiah? And so, for that reason, he looked through all the different prophecies that were made about the Messiah, and he decided that he was going to go about trying to fulfill them, so that he would appear like the Messiah. And the issue with this is that actually a lot of these prophecies were out of his control. It was things like how he was going to die, how he was going to be buried, his resurrection, and even as I've just said with Micah, his birthplace. You know, we don't choose our birthplace. So that's his fulfillment of prophecy. And the fifth one, I would say, is his conquest of death. If you ever read about Jesus, what you see is that again and again, what he's saying is, I haven't actually come to teach you. Like, yes, that's one thing I want to do, but I've essentially come to die. And the people who were around him just clearly never really understood this. They were like, this guy Jesus, he's an incredibly wise man, but he's just a bit weird in this way. That's not quite how they word it, but that's essentially the message that you get out of this. And what's really important here is that this idea of the resurrection, is supposedly that Jesus died and rose again. This is really essential to Christian belief. It's what's called the cornerstone of Christianity. And Richard Dawkins, the British atheist and writer, he said, if the resurrection is not true, Christianity becomes null and void. To which I completely agree. So what I want to do now, just before I finish, is just take the time to consider the evidence that the resurrection actually happened. We've looked at the evidence here to suggest that what Jesus claimed about himself was true. But now I just want to take the time to look at this evidence that the resurrection actually happened. So what evidence do we have? I'd say firstly, its absence from the tomb. There have been multiple theories throughout history to try and explain why this man Jesus' tomb was empty. And one of the first theories is he didn't actually die on the cross. But he somehow was, he kind of fainted from the pain, but was taken down off the cross, put in a cool tomb, was allowed to recover, and then kind of got away with it. And I'd say, quite frankly, this is slightly ridiculous in the sense that, firstly, this guy was flogged. Some people didn't even survive Roman flogging alone. He was then put on a cross, which was the most severe form of Roman execution. There's no evidence that anyone ever survived crucifixion. And when he died, his body was cocooned in heavy grave clothes, which aren't easy to get out of. And then he was placed in a tomb with 1.5 tons rock and a group of Roman guards, which obviously is quite hard to get past at the easiest of times. And interestingly, coming back to this Gospel of John, which I spoke about earlier, there's a bit in it and it says, but when they came to Jesus and found that he was already dead, so he's on the cross, and he looks lifeless, they did not break his legs. Because what they would actually do with crucifixion is you don't die of blood loss. What you actually die of is asphyxiation, because you can't keep your body weight up. So by breaking the legs, it would stop the support that you would have. They said instead, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. Now today we know that this indicates the separation of the clot and the serum in the blood, which is strong medical evidence that Jesus was in fact dead. So I'd argue that this theory, quite frankly, is a load of rubbish. The other theory is that the authorities stole the body. And again, this is really flawed, because if someone's going to claim that Jesus had risen from the dead, it would just take the authorities to say, no, he isn't, here's his body. And yet that doesn't happen. And then there's the theory that, well, maybe the disciples stole the body. And with everything I was saying earlier with relation to the Roman guards, the stone, this is still highly improbable in terms of the psychology of the situation. What it says is that when Jesus is arrested and taken away, everyone flees, everyone denies him. And yet, for some reason, within the space of a few days, there is a complete psychological turnaround where actually these people are prepared to go to their death for him. They preach, and for example, there's a guy called Thomas who knew Jesus, and he actually went all the way to India just to talk about Jesus to the people of India. And you have to ask yourself, would this dramatic turnaround have happened if actually they had stolen the body and Jesus was in their back garden? Would that have happened? There's then the theory that robbers stole the body. And again, there's similar flaws to the other ones that I've given. But interestingly, what we know from the evidence is that within the tomb, the one thing that was actually left was the thing which was the most expensive, the most valuable, and that was the grave clothes, because the grave clothes, basically within that tradition, they'll be filled with various spices. They're incredibly expensive, and if someone was going to rob a tomb, was going to be a tomb raider, they would always take the grave clothes. That was the expensive thing. So that was his absence from the tomb. Two is his presence among the disciples and others. Jesus basically reappeared to over 500 people on 11 different occasions. And we could argue, well, maybe there was some kind of hallucination taking place. But I think the issue with that is hallucinations are always very subjective. No two people have the same hallucinations. I remember when my dad was in hospital and he'd had copious amounts of morphine, and he was just convinced that his hands were on his face like this. And I was sat next to him and he was telling me this, and I said, "Dad, that's not happening. You're having a hallucination." And she says, in the scripture, after the resurrection has happened, it's put like this. It says, "While they were still talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, 'Peace be with you.' They were startled and frightened, thinking that they saw a ghost. He said to them, 'Why are you troubled, and why do doubts rise in your mind? Look at my hands, look at my feet. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as I have.' When he said this, he showed them his hands and his feet, and while they still did not believe it because of the joy and amazement, he asked them, 'Do you have anything to eat?' They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it in their presence." And so the third thing, just before I finish, the third thing I would say as well, that I think is strong evidence, is Christian experience through the ages. I say that billions of people down the ages have experienced Jesus Christ. People of every colour, race, tribe, continent, nationality, every economic, social, intellectual background. They all unite in this common experience of Christ. And I'd say from my own experience, all this evidence aside, and I just say, I personally am very confident that this is the truth, because I feel changed for it. I'd say I feel confident. I have a hope for my life. I have a peace for my life. I don't feel like I have something to prove. I don't feel like I have to justify myself in any way. I would say my life has been completely turned around. So we've looked at his absence from the tomb, his presence among the disciples, Christian experience through the ages. So in conclusion, I'm really aware we haven't got long, so I'm going to wrap this up really quickly. I've taken a logical approach to the question of who is Jesus. And what the point I'm trying to make is that we know that Jesus was a real man, because there are so many different sources, all with considerable credibility, the New Testament being the most credible one of them all, and actually being the source that is the most credible of its time. So because of that, we know that he existed, we know that he made certain claims about himself, we know the things that he did. We've also looked at the fact that he did not consider himself to be a good religious teacher. In fact, he claimed to be God. And so the crux of this talk is that there are three logical possibilities. Either he's insane, or evil, or God. And there's a quote attributed to the great fictional detective Sherlock Holmes. He said, "When you've eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth." And as we look at this evidence about what Jesus claimed, what he taught, his character, his fulfillment of prophecy, his works, his resurrection, I would argue that surely we can eliminate this idea that he was insane. Surely we can eliminate this idea that he was evil. And therefore, as Sherlock Holmes puts it, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth.